Hand it over to my CCPH colleagues in just a minute, but I just want to remind everybody and introduce myself. Again, my name is Nadia, and I'm the Senior Project Coordinator for the CEACR initiative. And I'll give you just a brief history of CEACR. So CEACR offers tailored consultation services guided by both academic and community-based insight to increase inclusive participation in health research efforts. Principles of trust and reciprocity are infused in feedback to help strengthen the researcher-participant relationship, creating partnerships that promote equity and inclusion. Today's session aims to highlight and discuss just one of the tripping points in community-engaged research efforts, partner compensation. Again, big thank you to my CCPH colleagues, Emily Finley and Paige Castro-Reyes, for hosting this discussion. We want to know if you like the content. We're going to drop a link in the chat for feedback. That's on its way. And Emily and Paige, please take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Paige Castro-Reyes, and I'm the Deputy Director for Community Campus Partnerships for Health. And today we are very excited to share a bit about our experience as a nonprofit organization in navigating institutional processes for proper partner compensation. A little bit about CCPH. Our mission is to promote health equity and social justice through partnerships between communities and academic institutions. And that can mean a lot of different things. Throughout our organization's lifetime of 25 years, we have navigated these types of partnerships through many different health disparities focuses, many different dynamics within the larger context of community engaged research, service learning. And today we are going to talk about that, as well as our experience with COVID-19 community engaged partnered projects. CCPH partners with community-based organizations and academic institutions across the US to provide equity and inclusion in response to COVID-19 and other health disparities. Our work and our organization works with 5 specific projects that are focused on COVID-19 to provide an infrastructure for community engagement. Those projects include the NIH-funded RADx Up project, Recover. We have the National COVID Resiliency Network, the National Network for COVID-19 and Adult Vaccine Equity, as well as the North Carolina CEAL project. And now my colleague, Emily Finley, will talk a little bit more about our involvement with CEACR.
Thank you, Paige, and welcome, everyone. So yes, CCPH partners with Pitt CTSI to support the CEACR project, which just launched this year. And the goal of CEACR is to support best practices and innovations in inclusive participation in research. So like Nadia said earlier, CEACR convenes tailored expert panels to support equitable research. And we also uplift assets, tools, and resources produced by projects in the CEAL Alliance. With the mission of integrating principles of trustworthiness and research reciprocity to ultimately support health equity. Next slide, please. And just once more, the speakers today are myself, Emily Finley, a CCPH program coordinator. I'm based in Philadelphia, PA. And my colleague, Paige Castro-Reyes, our CCPH Deputy Director, who is based in Washington State. Next.
So today we are going to be talking to you about something really exciting. We're going to be talking to you about paperwork. And these are our learning objectives for today: to review some common post-award compensation processes for community partners, to understand the barriers and facilitators to equitable community partner compensation processes, and to explore some models and action steps that your institution and your partnership can take to facilitate equity in these processes. Now, to bring us all together, we would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Please input your name and your pronouns, your location, and the institution or organization that you're representing today. Again, as Emily mentioned, this is a bi-coastal presentation. I am in Washington State, she is in Philadelphia, and so we already have national representation just with us too, but we would love to hear read where you guys are joining us from. We have St. Louis, Tucson, Michigan, Minneapolis, North Carolina, quite a diverse group regionally. So welcome, we're so excited to have you join us. Now, why exactly are we talking about paperwork, and what does this mean for community engagement? As it seems in the chat, many of you are affiliated with institutions and you know the importance of paperwork and why that is needed for your institution. And we are going to be talking about the ways in which we approach this paperwork and how it can impact the community engaged partnership. So our financial practices, how do they relate to community engagement? Firstly, transparency. This is a big theme that we'll be talking about today, and we will continue to talk about why transparency is important in this particular process, but it is generally important for your community engaged partnership. This transparency in communication helps facilitate reciprocity. We're going to be talking about how this process is very integral to the reciprocal nature of a partnership. It is about a sharing of resources and an exchange of resources that is overall beneficial to all of the stakeholders in the partnership. This process of exchanging financial resources in the ways that it is set up institutionally, as I will go over in the next section, inherently reinforces an unequal power dynamic. And approaching these processes with intentionality, with care, is very important to support an equitable partnership and one where power is dispersed across partners. This also contributes to trustworthiness and sustainability of a partnership. So the paperwork, as many of you all representing institutions today know how important it is, and the process of how it is approached can have significant impact on all of these elements in community engagement. So tell us in the chat, how are you including community partners in the research process? Or if you're a community partner, how are you involved in the research process? And I'll have my colleague, Emily, read back some of those responses.
Okay, we have a federal funding officer in the audience. Else. Oh, we have a person working with a community advisory board to guide the scope of their research. Great. Rapid panel response from a patient advocacy group. Okay. Anyone else like to share? Uplifting community voices. Oh, here now we have they all come in at once. Leading community informed research. Engaging with community site coordinator to determine goals. Building a bridge between investigators and the wider community through consultation, dissemination, and other programming. Community engaged research is the best research. Yes, we agree. Co-creating research design, co-addressing with community partners. Wonderful.
This is great. So it seems like we have representation of people that understand the beauty and benefits of community engaged partnerships and the ways that these reciprocal, ideally equitable partnerships can move us forward towards health equity and social justice. So now I'm going to talk about some common post-award onboarding practices. And so these practices might be representative of your experience. Some of them might be, or none of them, but this is for CCPH. We, again, are a nonprofit organization, and we have partnered with dozens of academic institutions over our 25 years and have a wealth of experience in navigating these partnerships from an administrative lens as well. And so I'm going to be going through. So you build your partnership and you're writing the proposal, and you have these wonderful ideas of how the institution and the community partners can come together and ideally can address these problems from a community-centered approach. And this is really exciting, especially given the enormous infusion of funding from national, federal, and philanthropic funders for community engaged work. And it's really exciting. I know personally how that feels when we get the email forwarded to us that our proposal has been accepted, and how we get from the proposal being accepted to us as a organization. And I'm going to say us as a community partner, because within this CEACR partnership, we are representing as community partners, how we receive those funds and what impact that process has on our ability to do the work. So getting from point A to point B can be quite a journey. And so again, this is moving a budget from fiction to reality. Our partner and colleague, Dr. Giselle Corby, often talks about moving from the proposal process to the project process of going from fiction to nonfiction. And so these are some of the steps that are involved in facilitating the sharing of resources that is inherent in a reciprocal and equitable partnership. So after the proposal is accepted, typically the prime recipient of a grant would be the academic institution. And that means that the funds would funnel from the funder through the institution and then out to the partners in the partnership. And that involves negotiating and navigating how the institution and the other entity of the community organization are going to relate to each other. there is a subcontract build out. There are different types of agreements that that some of you might have in lieu of a subcontract, such as a service agreement. But typically in our experience, this has been the standard for solidifying the partnership in the paperwork and legally between the different entities. So from subcontract build out to subcontract execution, that can take many weeks, many email threads of going back and forth with pulling information from the proposal, putting it into the subcontract, verifying as a community partner, have you done an audit? Are you up to date on these different registrations? There's a lot of different steps that are needed that community partners need to take to check off all of those boxes to ensure that the subcontract can be executed. After that subcontract is executed, then there needs to be a process of onboarding that community partner as a vendor. This will allow the community partner, after officially executing and solidifying the subcontract agreement, now we're going through the process of how do I technically receive the funds from the institution. And this process can be as simple as a form or two, or it can be a little more involved of registering for institution's online portal and going through all of those processes that, depending on the institution, how they like to have their vendors set up to receive payment. Then after the organization has been onboarded as a vendor, they get to submit their first invoice. And typically, as this whole process has been going on, the engagement work, the actual work of the proposal is simultaneously happening. The community partners are meeting, the advisory boards are meeting, they're planning different engagement events. Maybe they've had, in the time of COVID, a webinar or two, maybe they've done some mutual aid drives. It can take weeks, if not months, for this process just to get up to an invoice submitted to happen. And during that time, the community partner is not only doing the engagement work, they are doing this work that typically institutions have whole departments to navigate these processes. So this map and kind of roadmap of what a community partner goes through is just highlights a little more of the hidden, intensive, tedious work that is happening while also the engagement work is happening. After the invoice is submitted, then it might take some time for it to be approved, and then the community partner receives funds. But again, during this whole process, it can take weeks, sometimes months, from proposal to be accepted to community partner to receive funds, and time in between each of these steps. And that is quite a lot of additional kind of hidden labor on the plate of the community partner, while also being the one that is providing critical support and leadership in community engagement. Typically in a partnership, what we hear people talking about often is communication between the community partner and the institution-based partner, the researcher. And this process is bi-directional. There's great ideally, there's great rapport with each other. And when you get to this process of onboarding your partner to your institution's processes, this becomes quite a triangle between institutional partners and their administrators and the community partners. And I personally have been in those long email threads of going from this administrator handles this process, this administrator handles that process. And it takes quite a lot to adjust with who to communicate for which process. And this is really when the bigness, the institutional nature, the power dynamic, which even in the most transparent, equitable partnerships, which CCPH has been privileged to be a part of, this dynamic can be quite intensive. And we hope that as we look at this triangle and kind of really seeing that these partnerships, that while grounded in the most equitable partnership values, that there are still other players here that if you are an institution-based person, if you're an academic researcher, you are bringing with you your institution. And most of you all know that, but I think that as a person representing a nonprofit, it can be quite overwhelming. And that this dynamic, there have been experiences where we've been able to go through this dynamic with such understanding and transparency and grace. And again, CCPH is very fortunate to have such wonderful partners to navigate this. But it is also could very quickly sour the experience and the good work of the community engagement if the community partner is kind of navigating the complexity of these processes with at the same time as the engagement work. It just can feel very overwhelming. And my colleague Emily is going to talk more about some of those barriers.
Thank you, Paige. Yes, so I'm going to be discussing some barriers and also facilitators to equitable community department payment processes. Next slide, please. So for this part of the presentation, I'm going to be drawing heavily from a study published by Dr. Lori Carter-Edwards and others in 2021. The research team conducted in-depth interviews with a mix of community and academic key informants to understand challenges and best practices in fiscal processes for community engaged research. And this is a list of what they found to be key considerations for understanding and establishing equitable payment processes. These are sort of the ingredients to the sauce, if you will. So the level of partnership equity refers to each partner's level of engagement and decision-making power during the pre and post-award processes. So typically, academic partners have large finance departments and dedicated administrators who can coordinate directly with funders, which often gives them the greater control over fiscal decision-making. And it also relieves researchers of administrative labor. Partners at smaller CBOs who don't have this level of administrative infrastructure end up taking on that labor, such as managing staffing, payroll, tax reporting, expense tracking, in addition to all of the actual grant activities. And often the academic institutions are the direct recipient of funds, whereas community partners are subcontractors. And the academic partners may take the lead in writing grant applications and may not consider the feasibility of their proposal to the CBO. And this can create an unequal power structure where CBOs are accountable to large institutions for their budget and spending, but the CBOs aren't as accountable, the institutions are not really accountable to the CBOs in the same way, and which is an inequity. And the level of collaboration and communication among partners is also really important. It's important to communicate early and often among all of the partners involved, so that everyone understands the fiscal agreements being made and knows what to expect. And as I'm sure we're all aware, academic institutions often have very complex and opaque fiscal policies, procedures, and requirements. So that's a lot of bureaucratic red tape can accompany these processes, and that puts up barriers for small organizations. And moreover, both CBO representatives and the researchers themselves may not have much familiarity with fiscal processes. And this can make it more challenging for all partners to troubleshoot problems and also to advocate for their needs as the grant continues. And also, research administrators may not understand the responsibilities and needs of the CBOs in the grant. So it's important for this learning and communication to be bidirectional and consider each partner's infrastructure and capacity. And then finally, regarding financial management expectations, do partners have realistic and clear expectations of the fiscal process? Do subcontractors understand the processes and timeline for reimbursement? Are the processes reasonable? These are some of the key considerations. So next slide, please. So this slide is a quote from a community partner drawn from that same study. And I selected this quote to highlight because it really touches on all of those considerations related to equity. And so I'll read the quote for you. As a small nonprofit, sometimes we need that money. It takes 8 weeks for the check to come and we're already starting working. That's a long time for someone like us. Usually it requires some sort of invoicing, which inevitably gets sent back. Now this quote stood out to me because it's not a unique situation. I think a lot of CBOs who are participating in community engaged research come up against this barrier. And we see that the partners' expectations are not being met as to the timeliness of the payments. That's an indication that there hasn't been enough communication between the researcher, administrator, and partner to set those expectations. And we also see that the payment delays place a direct burden on the staff and organization as a whole. So this can be problematic when a grant opportunity is supposed to help an organization grow, not cause them to flounder. And it also sounds like this person is dealing with some complicated processes around invoicing, and maybe they haven't received proper training in those processes to help make it smoother and less complicated. Next slide, please. So this shows some barriers and facilitators to fiscal equity that were identified by the research team. So like we've said, communication gaps can be a big barrier because it affects people's expectations of the project. Often there's limited support or consideration of the community partners' fiscal capacity. There may be lack of awareness of each partner's different processes, procedures, and needs. And as we've said, there are often very complex administrative processes involved that can be very difficult to navigate. But on the other hand, some facilitators to fiscal equity that they identified are shared decision-making among all partners involved. Early and timely communication from the pre-award phase all the way through the post-award phase. And that continued engagement. So next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it to Paige Castro-Reyes, who's going to present a few different models for achieving fiscal equity.
Thank you, Emily. So in this next section, in continuation with the facilitators that Emily presented, we're going to give you a couple of different examples, both CCPH, how we operate as a nonprofit in these partnerships, doing community engagement, as well as some different going over some of the different payment delivery models that we have experienced. And the overall theme of this section is to balance compliance with timeliness, because those are really the critical parts of navigating this process, that the institution wants to ensure that there is compliance, they are accountable to the funder, they are accountable to their institutional processes, but also they are accountable to the community partners. And we want to make sure that these processes are happening in a timely manner and that they are not burdensome to the community partners. So as mentioned earlier in the presentation, CCPH is one of the leading partners with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill and Wake Forest on the North Carolina CEAL project. CCPH operates in this partnership as the partner providing resources, training, infrastructure, and support for community engagement. And one of those processes that we support is we actually funnel the funds from our subaward to community partners. Now, this is a particular model that CCPH has utilized multiple times in the past. We are a nonprofit organization with national reach and national friends and partners that we have been privileged to do multiple and recurring community engagement projects with our community partners. And we know that with those partners, we have built trust, we have built a relationship that whether you are new or whether you are one of our longtime partners, we want to ensure that there is, that they're feeling supported, that their community is feeling supported. And so CCPH kind of acts as this liaison between the institution or the prime recipient and the community partners that we are directly engaging. And some of the different things that CCPH, some of the different activities that CCPH has supported financially through our sub-award agreement is CCPH has distributed mini grants to over $100,000 of mini grants to various community-based organizations in North Carolina. We have provided support and presenter stipends and even providing the support for translation and interpretation on our various different virtual engagement activities. And one of the most intensive ways that we support our this project is by providing monthly recurring payments to community partners and community co-leads that are involved on in the first iteration of this project on 3 different community response teams. And those community response teams were for the African American community, the Latinx community, and the Native community. And so CCPH, because knowing knowing how long it can take for a community partner to receive one check, we knew that it was going to be important, and our partners knew with UNC that it would be important for CCPH, because of the flexibility we have as a nonprofit, that we would be able to deliver those monthly recurring payments to our community partners. And again, the benefit of this is it allows us to deliver payments to our partners in a more flexible manner. We can deliver it via check, we can do direct deposit in a timely manner. We also can support our community members in different ways that, especially as it relates to immigration status or tax liability status, CCPH is able to be responsive to those different needs and limitations. But the thing that we realize is that not every partnership can have this kind of dynamic. CCPH is situated in a very unique place as being a national nonprofit with various different regional reach. And that is not always feasible for your partnership, or even that is not always what is most beneficial in the structure of your partnership. One other thing that I do want to say here on this particular project is this is truly a partnership where there is equitable leadership across the different organizations represented. Our executive director is an MPI on this project. Our communities and the communities that we support in this project play an integral role to the success of the research. And this project, as all of you that are a part of the CEAL Alliance or other COVID-related projects, you know how critical it is for us to be getting the funds, the resources, the support directly to the community as soon as possible. And so at the beginning of setting up this project, which happened so fast in response to the pandemic, there were moments where we had to adjust in terms of figuring out what is the best way for our nonprofit organization to best support the community partners, figuring out a way for our institutional partners as the prime recipient of the grant to deliver the resources to us as soon as possible. And so in this process, this type of engagement, I personally feel is only possible because of the joint leadership and respect and mutual reciprocity across the partners, that this would not have been able to happen if CCPH, if the community partners were not valued and integral into the partnership as we have been. Some of the different things that we have experienced both in the NC CEAL project as well as our various other projects, CCPH, not only for this particular project with North Carolina CEAL, but for our 7 to 9 other programs, we support community engagement in one way or another economically. And so we've had to navigate some of the different payment delivery models from institution to community partner. And, so I'm just gonna go through some of these different models and talk a little bit more about some of our personal experience with that, which again, might be reflective of what your experience is, or it might not. So typically, most of these projects, most of these grants, the subcontracts can be, the funds can be paid to community partners through a cost reimbursable model. This means that the community partner submits invoices to be reimbursed funds that have already been spent. This is a lower risk for institutions because you are paying for the actual cost of what was done. And this is typical for most of our subcontract agreements. The thing about this, which many of you already know, is that this puts the risk on the community partner to cover the upfront costs, as Emily shared in our previous section on barriers to equity, that this is a really heavy burden for the community partner, that these grants and these projects and these opportunities are sometimes organization saving, that these resources are so critical to be able to provide support to sustain the organization. And if they're not able, they don't have the financial cushion that an institution does. And this can be quite stressful for the community partner. Sometimes this is the only option that your institution will allow for payment to be delivered. And so some things that we as a nonprofit have negotiated with our institutional partners to reduce some of this burden include reducing the amount of time it takes from an invoice to be submitted to an invoice being processed, and also doing monthly invoicing. And I think, again, that our institutional partners were able to advocate for this on our behalf, not only because we have a relationship with those researchers, but also we are written into these projects as multiple principal investigators. Our institutions are one of the leading organizations. And so there is more of a, more accountability that the institution has to us because we are so woven into the grant. And I strongly believe that that shared leadership is what helps facilitate this kind of creativity. Another creative payment delivery model that we have been able to utilize is a cash advance. And this allows funds to be made available to community partners upfront. This does place a higher risk on the institution because financially, because you are putting the funds out there to the community, and you don't know, you just haven't verified what has been spent. You don't know how it's going to be spent, but really you do know how it's going to be spent. And there is a higher level of scrutiny for paperwork on the community partner to verify these costs after the fact. And this, again, is not always allowable by your institution, or your institution might not allow it for certain line items. For example, mini grants or participant stipends versus personnel costs. And so the thing that as we go in to talk about immediate action steps and long-term action steps and recommendations, and the title of this webinar on humanizing these processes, these paperwork processes are there for a reason, to ensure that there is compliance, that things are flowing and are being accounted for in ways that are trackable, in ways that don't put the institution at risk. But I would like to implore you to consider, what is the risk of the community partner, of being in partnership with your institution, given the processes that your institution has set as the standard, and thinking about the ways that we can be creative. And so my colleague, Emily, is going to finish us up with some of those action steps and recommendations.
All right, thank you, Paige. So yeah, so we've outlined a lot of problems, but also some solutions that CCPH has found. So what are some more immediate action steps that folks can take now to start addressing fiscal inequity? So the first is to include your community partners in pre and post award processes. This allows for shared decision-making from the start, and it also recognizes the goals and interests of the community partners. If you can include your community partners in grant writing and compensate them for that, that's even better. Because everybody will then have a greater stake in the grant activities. Another thing is to be transparent with partners about approval processes and payment timelines. You could develop a memorandum of understanding that lays out all of these processes. Also, make sure that you are explaining processes in a way that is accessible and responsive to partners. Use clear, plain language. These can be very complicated concepts to understand for people who don't have a background in fiscal processes. And so being clear and transparent is very important. And then also outline clear procedures for tracking and managing payments. Make sure you're tracking all partners' expenditures, and have a system for reviewing paperwork before it gets submitted to eliminate some of that back and forth with administrators that can add a lot of time to getting a payment through. Next slide, please. And some more long-term action steps is to support CBOs in building fiscal and administrative knowledge, skills, and infrastructure. So this could mean providing training and education to community members, developing resources around fiscal administrative processes that are community facing and accessible. And also to hire community members as researchers, because that ultimately builds a lot of internal capacity for the CBO. And another long-term action step is to develop infrastructure to deliver timely and flexible payments to your community partners. Include a fiscal administrator in the development of procedures beforehand, so that everything is clear. Consider providing cash advances if possible. And finally, embrace equitable power sharing with community partners by applying the principles of partnership when developing administrative processes. There was a wonderful question in the chat earlier about supporting the CBPR aspects, community-based participatory research aspects of increasing community partner capacity. How can we take principles of community-based participatory research and apply them to the administrative side of the grant in addition to the grant activities themselves. So that's a wonderful consideration. And finally, for the next slide, oh, and one more thing, you can view CCPH's Principles of Partnership on our website. We can put a link in the chat. So finally, we have some recommendations for funders. First, to disperse funding more equitably across grantees. This can prevent larger institutions from being gatekeepers, which can put up more barriers for community partners. Require a well-devised community partner compensation plan as part of the grant application. This could really go a long way in making sure that your grantees are considering all of these compensation steps in advance and developing a plan, so there aren't as many surprises that come along during the grant period. And then finally, funders can also play a role in providing administrative capacity building and training opportunities for grantees. And so that's something that, you know, both an academic partner or a funder could do, but really, you know, training can be useful for all of the partners in the grant, because oftentimes, you know, administrative processes of a CBO and an academic institution are very, very different. And so just establishing a common understanding can be really impactful. And so now it is 2 o'clock now. We were hoping to have time for questions, but I will turn it back over to Paige to close us out.
Thank you, Emily. So thank you again for joining us today. We received some great questions in the chat, and we also invite you to collaborate with CEACR. You can either request a tailored consultation, or you can serve on an expert panel and provide some of your expertise, your lived experience in navigating community engagement. Nadia has put in the chat some of these different links. And these are our resources. The slides will be made available to registrants afterwards. And thank you again so much for taking some time to talk about this really exciting topic with us. We hope that you will visit CCPH, our website, for more information. CCPH provides trainings on the fundamentals of community engagement, trainings on structural racism, and have a number of resources for community engagement on our website. And I believe that is all. Thank you so much. Nadia, if there's anything else that you would like to wrap up, but I also just want to thank Emily for joining me today. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you all with any follow-up questions that you might have.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Thank you to our speakers and caption services, translation services, and everybody who joined. Hope you found that valuable. Please, please, please let us know if we can provide any more content on something that might be a little more up your alley, or what, you know, any content that you're looking for. Let us know through that survey and the link. Again, thank you everybody for joining. And if you want to know a little bit more about CEACR and what we can offer, again, link in the chat. Thank you guys so much for your time, and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See ya.